All right. Thank you all for joining in on this occasion. I have to say that for me, this series of meetings of the Bloch Study Group has been one of the real silver linings of this current pandemic, this difficult period. And even though I've never met you in person, I feel like I've come to know you. And I really appreciate this shared sense of cordiality and commitment in this group. So my topic today is the reception of Bloch in fascist Italy. But I need to qualify a couple of things at the outset, including that phrase. The focus obviously is on reception, that is how Bloch's music was received by the public in Italy, by Bloch's fellow musicians, by critics and journalists. When we're dealing with figures of international renown, this kind of reception history can grow to immense proportions, which is why it's customary to break it down, divide the reception history into different regions or different periods. So the reception of Shakespeare would be ridiculously large as a topic, but we can bite off a smaller chunk, discuss Shakespeare reception in the French Enlightenment or among the German Romantics. In a similar way, there are all kinds of studies on the reception of Berlioz in Russia, Wagner reception in France, all perfectly normal, respectable fields of inquiry. But with regard to Ernest Bloch, Italy is far more than another province on a map that we're filling in with so many reception histories. It can be argued, and I'll be explaining my reasons for arguing this, that Italy occupies a central place within this larger story, or at least a lot more central than commonly recognized. Two of the reasons we can cite right off the bat, because they're fairly well known to Blochians. Although Bloch for years had been covered extensively in the press, including many musical journals and magazines, the first published full-length study of Bloch and his music was written in Italian by Mary Tibaldi Chiesa, whom I'll discuss presently. This book came out in 1933. I'm going to share my screen so I can let you see a couple of images while I talk. There we go. That is a picture of the book. And this is kind of a remarkably important volume in many ways, although it has been criticized to a certain extent. Another important reason why Italy, I think, is central to Bloch has to do with an important premiere. One of his most celebrated works, The Sacred Service, takes place in 1934 in the Italian city of Torino, where it was sung in an Italian translation by this same Mary Tibaldi Chiesa, in a concert not only given before a live audience, but broadcast throughout Italy over what was referred to as the IER, that's an acronym for the Italian State Radio Network, formerly taken over by the fascist government in 1927. That's the second time I've used the word fascist, and so we also need to address one of the things that I find so compelling about this topic, that is the striking paradox of what I've just mentioned, that the first published monograph on Bloch and the world premiere of the Sacred Service happened within the borders of a country which was to become a firm ally of the Nazi government of Germany in World War II, and which even before the war had already nurtured close relations with the Nazis, marked by various incidents, their joint support of Francisco Franco in his attempt to overthrow the Spanish Republic in 1936, and a cordial meeting between Hitler and Mussolini in Munich in 1937, and finally the so-called leggi razziali, the racial laws, Italy's own anti-Semitic legislation, modeled on the Nuremberg laws and promulgated in 1938. How do we explain this paradox? Well, first of all, by pointing out that although Germany and Italy became allies, there are very significant differences between German Nazism and Italian fascism. Although this is often obscured by the nomenclature in common use. That is, the word fascist is often employed in a much broader sense, an umbrella term which covers not only the Italy of Mussolini, but also the Germany of Hitler, as well as other groups, the Iron Guard in Romania, the Ustaše movement in Croatia, and so on. In one especially relevant respect, the Italian fascist movement was quite different from certain of these other movements. Namely, at least in certain instances, it specifically rejected anti-Semitism. For that reason, Italy was filled with manifestations of tolerance almost impossible to conceive in Nazi Germany. Jewish participation in the fascist movement was welcomed. Italian Jews actually joined the party in very high proportion, in numbers triple to their proportion in the overall population. After the Nazis ascended to power in 1933, Italy provided a safe haven for Jews escaping persecution in Germany, which later got to be a source of tension between the Italian government and the German government. There was a pro-fascist Jewish periodical, La Nostra Bandiera, our banner, which was established in 1934 as an outlet for that considerable portion of Italian Jews anxious to declare their loyalty to Mussolini. Mussolini himself met several times with Chaim Weizmann in 1934. On occasion expressed his support for Zionism, and at one point emphatically denied that fascism had anything to do with anti-Semitism. He dismissed theories of racial purity as ridiculous. And finally, it was an open secret, at least among insiders, that the Jewish journalist Margherita Sarfatti, who is Mussolini's first biographer, was also his mistress. Now, there's also a long prehistory to these complications. Compared to many other parts of Europe, the history of Italy offers no example of a violently anti-Semitic movement analogous to those which had emerged in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. There are no episodes comparable to the Dreyfus Affair in France or the blood libel trial of Baylis in Kiev. Not that it was a bed of roses. There was also a tradition of persecution and restriction and ghettos, but by and large, Italian Jews had been thoroughly integrated into much of the Italian cultural landscape for centuries. Something else to keep in mind with regard to Italian fascism once it assumed power at the end of 1922. Its transformation into full-scale tyranny was actually quite gradual. Initially, opposition parties continued to operate. Openly anti-fascist newspapers were permitted to publish, at least for a few years, and a good deal of cultural life simply continued on as before, without interference. Compare that to the radical change which overtakes Germany soon after January 1933, including the treatment of Jews as exemplified by well-known cases in the musical world, Jewish musicians fired from orchestras, conductors like Bruno Walter, Otto Klemperer fired from their positions, a ban on the works of Felix Mendelssohn, and so on. So in marked contrast to all of that, Italian fascists had been in power for 15 years before the persecution of Jews became government policy. This positive reception of Ernest Bloch, and it is an overwhelmingly positive reception, is only one part of that picture. There are several other Italian composers of Jewish background who had perfectly bustling, successful careers during the same period. I'll be getting to one of them later on. And as far as Gentiles are concerned, Another slide, maybe I can show you. Let me get to this. All right. Of all of the newly composed Italian operas in the 1930s, by far the biggest hit was this Il Dybbuk, based on the celebrated play The Dybbuk by Ansky, which was performed in Italy in Torino in 1929 and other places around the same time, and later became the source for the libretto of this opera. This has been written about by Aloma Bardi, an Italian musicologist, who has pointed out a central paradox of the opera, which is that unlike the original play by Ansky, who was an ethnographer and an ethnologist, collected Jewish folk tales and Hasidic lore and songs and dances, Lodovico Rocca had absolutely no acquaintance, no familiarity with this cultural milieu. He simply wrote his own very intensely melodramatic score in the Italian manner for this. And I'd like to just play one snippet of it. Not sure just how audible that was. This is a very touching, tender moment towards the end after the exorcism has taken place, when the two young lovers are basically bidding farewell forever and singing a kind of lullaby for all of the children that they would have had if it had been possible for them actually to marry. And it's a very typical Italian ninna nanna in a kind of classic Italian rocking lullaby style. And yet, the fact that this is a hit performed in many cities in Italy in the 1930s is itself a testament to something. The tremendous interest in Jewish culture, the very high level of tolerance and respect accorded to this whole phenomenon, all of which happening in the Italy of Mussolini. Because Italy saw a much more gradual transition to a totalitarian state that is marked by complete government control of everything: publishing, education, performance, labor unions, athletics, the economy. It would be a mistake to look for a sudden break in Italian culture at the beginning of 1923. When the fascist government took power, there wasn't a lot that changed in the world of music. The 1922-23 concert season continued right along as planned. The opera theaters that season presented the works that had been announced. And in the following years as well, if you kept up with the musical news in Italy, I think you'd find it difficult to notice any significant change. And so the story of Bloch reception in fascist Italy really begins with the period before. And I'd like to pause over some of the earlier phases of Italian Bloch reception for what we can learn from them about Bloch and his Italian admirers. Okay, another slide to show you. Il Brando Pizzetti. Let me just get this up for you. You know, I have an idea. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Il Brando Pizzetti is a tremendously important figure in Italian music, especially between the wars. And he wrote one of the very first Italian articles about Ernest Bloch. This was back in 1911, shortly after he had gotten to know Bloch's opera Macbeth. And I wanted to point out just how this article was printed on the page of this periodical. First of all, notice the curious title of the article, Profiles of Contemporary French Musicians. And in fact, this article was one of a series of articles about French composers. There was one on Debussy, one on Ravel, one on Gustave Charpentier, and I think a couple of others. It's not that Pizzetti didn't know that Bloch was Swiss. But as he explains in the first paragraph, Bloch is from Geneva. In Geneva, people are Francophone. And I suppose that combined with the fact that he was referring most of all to a French opera premiered at the Opéra Comique in Paris, justified this kind of categorization of Bloch as, along with a group of French composers, contemporary composers. This is a very interesting article that he writes about Bloch. The preoccupation with opera shouldn't surprise us in an Italian writer. Although he erroneously claims that Bloch's only published work up to that time was Macbeth, probably because he hadn't looked into the matter too deeply. But Italian composers at this time were busily thinking about the problem of opera, what to do with it, where it had come, what might come next. That is to say, they're trying to work their way out from under the weight of a romantic tradition of 19th century melodrama. And one of the things that Bloch is praised for by Pizzetti is being so much better than Verdi in creating an opera on the subject of Shakespeare's Macbeth. So he has this rather startling comparison between the Macbeth operas of Verdi and Bloch. And the bottom line is that, according to Pizzetti, Bloch succeeds much better than Verdi because Verdi managed no more than a simple assortment of insignificant tunes and even more insignificant orchestral noise. So that's quite an audacious swipe at a very sacred cow. More to the point is what precisely interests Pizzetti in Bloch and this opera, which is that with a thoroughly dramatic character, the opera refuses to yield to any purely musical or lyrical impulse. There is no show-stopping aria. There's no show-stopping anything. Every note of the score fits into the dramatic vision and the working out of the story of Macbeth. In that way, he finds it comparable to Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, Debussy's Pelléas, and Mélisande. So that's very high praise. But it's tempered somewhat by a few critical comments about supposed deficiencies of Bloch. Those defects are chalked up to Bloch's youth and inexperience, which is kind of odd because Bloch was actually 2 months older than Pizzetti. And Pizzetti ends by expressing confidence that Bloch is going to improve as he goes along. And I think that this is also a case where we can think in terms of a real influence by Bloch on an Italian. At the time of the publication of this article, Pizzetti had begun but not completed a number of operatic projects. His first opera premiered in 1915, some years later. Suffice it to say that his profile as an opera composer follows very closely the dramatic ideal that he identifies in Bloch's Macbeth. So if we can't speak of a direct stylistic influence on Pizzetti, we can certainly point to Bloch as a general aesthetic model. One final observation about this article concerns the image of Bloch among Italians. So many of the Italian critics have a lot to say about Bloch's Jewishness. And it's a rather interesting thing. I get the sense that a number of them get rather carried away in their interest and their enthusiasm over the way that Bloch's Jewishness is manifest in various scores. And this applies not only to works in the Jewish cycle, but also works that have nothing whatsoever to do with the Jewish cycle, even works that Bloch himself identified as among his non-Jewish works. This particular article predates the Jewish cycle, and therefore he doesn't say a word about anything related to Jews. And that's despite the fact that he even mentions that Bloch's current project, as of this writing, is an opera on Jezebel, which we know Bloch never actually completed, at least not as an opera. Getting back to the question of calling Bloch a French composer, or at least categorizing him in that way, that's not the only confusion that I've come across in Italian periodicals of the 1920s and 30s. And I have found Bloch variously described as Swiss, American, Jewish, and in one case, German. I guess because the name itself is Germanic. And along similar lines, in his autobiography, the Italian Jewish composer Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco shares an interesting anecdote, which I haven't found cited by anyone. This is about the conductor Toscanini. Toscanini was in attendance at a general rehearsal for Shlomo in Milan, conducted by Vittorio Gui. After the rehearsal, Castelnuovo Tedesco overheard Toscanini saying to Vittorio Gui, "But in the end, what does this Swiss composer want? What kind of music is this?" And the Italian original of that last sentence, "Che razza di musica è questa?" Literally means, "What race of music is this?" It's a very common Italian expression. When you hear it, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with race. It's just a kind of idiomatic construction. And we can translate it as, "What kind of music is this?" At which point the young composer boldly inserts himself into the conversation and answers, "It's Jewish music, e musica ebraica." And Toscanini, he says, gave him a sidelong glance, but did not reply. I imagine that Castelnuovo Tedesco had studied composition at the Florence Conservatory with Pizzetti. And he recalls from that early period of study with Pizzetti that Bloch was one of the very few contemporary musicians that Pizzetti admired. Castelnuovo Tedesco's memoir has a number of other interesting tidbits relating to Bloch, whom he came to know personally when Bloch visited Florence in 1932. And one of these tidbits is worth sharing with you, since it relates to this sort of same, somewhat limited topic of Bloch's musical influence on Italian culture. So, in speaking of one of his own works for solo piano, here's what Castelnuovo Tedesco writes about a piece called The Dances of King David. And here again, I think I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. So sorry. I'm not going to share my screen after all, but I will let you hear this in a moment. Bloch, in 1925, writes a series of pieces called Dances of King David. And in his autobiography, he says as follows: "The title, Dances of King David, came to me as a kind of response to Shlomo. Because if there was anything in Shlomo which bothered me, it was a certain crying element, a memory of the weeping wall, of the dreamers of the ghetto held in captivity. The King Solomon of Bloch was not the poet of the Song of Songs, who was so dear to me, and who enchanted the Queen of Sheba, but rather the sententious Solomon of the Book of Proverbs, and still more the bitter pessimist of Ecclesiastes. I, however, preferred the figure of the other king, that young, brave, combative, passionate man who played the harp in the presence of the Lord and danced before the holy ark. I did not want in my own music echoes of mortification and weeping, but rather the memory of the distant epic of heroic times, a joyous seal of hope. All right, let me just let you hear a brief snippet of this Dances of King David. Okay. I think you'll agree that this sounds very little like Bloch, which is, of course, precisely what Castelnuovo Tedesco was aiming for. It's not so much a matter of influence, but of a kind of anti-influence. Bloch serves as a model of something which Castelnuovo Tedesco wanted to avoid. But before we leave this composer aside, there's one more of his works for solo piano that you need to know about, since it does the opposite. This is a direct imitation of Bloch's style as it appears in Shlomo. So let's do this. Okay. And we're going to go on to one further moment from this piece. That is a piece called, believe it or not, Ba, Variations on a Children's Theme, Variazioni su un tema infantile. Except that children's theme that you heard first is not an established tune known or sung by children. That theme is Castelnuovo Tedesco's invention. You may have noticed it's set out with a nice sense of humor. There's a tempo marking of allegro infantile. And although it's a piano and vocal, the composer notated a kind of suggested word underlay of nonsense syllables for that theme, suggestive of the babbling of a small child. But what really counts in this piece is the series of variations heard afterward. 12 variations altogether, each one designated omaggio, or homage, after the manner of Debussy's Hommage à Rameau. And each of those homages is named after not only a specific composer, but a specific work by that composer. So, for example, the first variation is a homage to Ravel with the indication Ondine, the first piece from Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit. Other variations are homages to Debussy Prelude, Jardin sous la pluie, Stravinsky's Pulcinella, the C minor Prelude in Book 1 of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, and so on. All of these variations presented within this exceedingly clever framework. That is, they're all variations on that same children's theme we just heard. Well, that third variation, as you saw, is called Shalomo. It is designated Omaggio a Bloch. And you can hear how cleverly he imitates the style, making use of that theme, but altering the intervals, playing it in this kind of rhapsodic fashion down in the cello range, and so on. Now, both of these people I've been talking about, Pizzetti and Castelnuovo Tedesco, are equivocal figures in a way. Both of them are principally composers, but they also published a fair amount of music criticism. A number of Castelnuovo Tedesco's articles on Bloch in particular have been reprinted in various sources. Some of these are very enthusiastic, reviews of Baal Shem and the Violin Sonata. Others more reserved, like the review of the Piano Sonata. But I'd like to turn away from these composers who were part-time critics to certain Italian figures who devoted themselves more to criticism, several mighty wars on behalf of. So we have, for example, the two Guidos, Guido Panayin in Naples, Guido M. Gatti in Torino. And we have Mary Tebaldi Chiesa, absolutely pivotal figure in Bloch's Italian reception. Castelnuovo Tedesco, who is also a friend of Tebaldi Chiesa, refers to her in his memoir as Bloch's propagandist, which is actually a very accurate way to think of her. In the last year, I've been trying to find out more about her, and it hasn't been easy. I haven't been able to get hold of either of her own 2 volumes of memoirs. I'm unable to read the articles she wrote for L'Ambrosiano, a daily newspaper in Milan. There is an historian in Italy named Silvio Berardi who's published 2 biographical studies of Tebaldi Chiesa, neither one of them apparently touching on music. The focus is her political life, which is in fact quite fascinating and worth talking about here and now. After the war, she was elected to the Italian parliament, becoming the first woman in parliament to represent the Partito Repubblicano Italiano. I'm saying Partito Repubblicano because I'm afraid that if I say Republican Party, some people might get the wrong idea. The Partito Repubblicano was a political party with what seems to me a very honorable history. They positioned themselves in the Mazzinian line of Italian political thought going back to the 19th century. And 2 of their main lines of argumentation were opposition to the idea of a hereditary monarchy as a desirable form of government, and they favored a strict separation of church and state. Mary Tebaldi Chiesa was the daughter of Eugenio Chiesa, one of the founders of that party. He had gone into exile in France, together with other leaders of the Republican Party, in the aftermath of the assassination of a socialist member of parliament by fascist agents, Giacomo Matteotti. That is to say, right before the years when Mary Tebaldi Chiesa is actively promoting the music of Ernest Bloch, getting to know him personally, organizing concert tours and so forth, her father was living in exile where he helped to coordinate the anti-fascist movement from abroad. After the war, she continued along similar lines, and aside from being elected to parliament, was active in the cause of international cooperation and women's rights. And it's nice to be able to point these things out because they form a counterbalance to Bloch's other passionate defender, Pizzetti, who was an outspoken supporter of the fascist regime. It shows that Bloch's appeal, in a way, cuts across political lines. Not an easy thing for a contemporary cultural figure to do in the 1930s. And I think that something can be glimpsed of Tebaldi Chiesa's broad cosmopolitan outlook, even in The musical biographies she wrote, monographs devoted to Bloch, Liszt, Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky, and two Italians, Cimarosa and Paganini. Her Partito Repubblicano background is also in keeping with her publication of articles on Bloch in two Italian Jewish periodicals in the 1930s. And from what I've seen, it's quite rare for non-Jewish authors to be contributing articles to those publications. As the daughter of an enemy of the state, Mary Tebaldi Chiesa paid a price. Her passport was withdrawn. She was placed under strict surveillance, but that seems to have relaxed after her father's death in 1930, which is when Bloch settled down for a while in Roveredo, in the Ticino canton of Switzerland, for what he thought and hoped would be a period of spiritual and artistic regeneration amid the natural beauty of the hills outside of Lugano. This is what the Swiss musicologist Carlo Picardi had in mind when referring to the speranze interrotte, the interrupted hopes of Ernest Bloch, in a very interesting essay published in 2012. In effect, Bloch's time for regeneration was rather sharply curtailed, and we have Mary Tebaldi Chiesa to thank for that. In 1931, she visited Bloch from Milan, which is where she was based, and in short order organized a number of visits by Bloch to Italian cities where his music was performed. Naples, Florence, Venice, and Torino, and Milan. Those were just the tours organized by Tebaldi, and of course there had been many other performances of Bloch's music that he did not attend. This is all happening around the same time that she publishes her book about Ernest Bloch. She was present at the 1934 premiere of The Sacred Service, and I think it's safe to say that without her tireless advocacy in that period, that premiere probably would not have taken place in Italy. It's another significant figure for Bloch in Italy, Guido M. Gatti, one of the most competent, knowledgeable music critics active in Italy over a remarkably long period, from before the First World War until the 1970s. Gatti himself devoted several important articles to the music of Ernest Bloch. He also founded an important magazine, the monthly periodical Il Pianoforte, in 1927, which covered Ernest Bloch extensively and positively. Some of Mario Casanova Tedesco's articles were published in Gatti's periodical Il Pianoforte. For a time, Gatti was also the superintendent of the same theater in Torino where Bloch's Sacred Service was first performed. And although he had left that position by the time of the premiere, to me this looks like circumstantial evidence that he too had much to do with the organizing of that event in that time and place. Just last year I learned that a number of letters written to Gatti by Bloch had ended up in the possession of a collector, now 90 years old, who lives in Fratta Polesine, small town in the Veneto. I had hoped to see them this summer, but it looks as though I'll have to be patient. Joseph Levinsky and Emmanuel Dijon make an interesting critical remark about the Bloch-related writings of Gatti and Tebaldi Chiesa. That is, they refer to these writings as hagiographic. And, in fact, they are so fulsome in their praise for every note of every piece that Bloch composed, and so inspired by Bloch's elevated human qualities as a man, as a visionary, that at times it's a little hard to know what to make of them. And I wanted to be sure to discuss a couple of cases on the other side, the other end of the continuum of Bloch reception in Italy. One of these is an article by Fedele D'Amico, which has been discussed in the literature, most notably by the scholar I mentioned earlier, Carlo Picardi. I'm going to just show you a brief frame of this article. Share screen. There it is, Su Ernesto Bloch, published in February 1933 in this cultural journal, L'Italia Letteraria. This has got to be the single most vicious attack on Ernest Bloch ever penned by an Italian music critic. Fedele D'Amico was the son of Silvio D'Amico, the most eminent theater critic and theater historian in Italy at the time. And I suspect that this had something to do with his ability to publish this article at the tender age of 21. Often in life it helps to have connections. So what are his objections to Bloch in this article? Very briefly, it's a long article. He's bothered by the fact that critics such as Guido Gatti and Guido Panahin have made outlandish claims for Bloch's music based entirely on extraneous information about Bloch's spiritual outlook, without ever examining the scores themselves, which reveal themselves on examination to be very weak. Another charge, as D'Amico sees it, contemporary musicians, to their credit, have been committed to a necessary rethinking of the language of music, with Stravinsky, and Bartók, Hindemith, Schoenberg, and others all making their individual good faith contributions to that collective project, while Bloch, by contrast, has stayed out of it, disdained the whole enterprise, on the grounds that his noble character exempts him from the hard work involved. All he needs to do is feel and create. D'Amico raises other objections. Besides, he finds Bloch prolix and lacking in self-control. Very strange complaint in an article which goes on for at least 3 times as long as it needs to. I don't know if Bloch ever read this article, at least in its complete form in the journal L'Italia Letteraria, but there is no question that he knew about it, because it was referred to and quoted in something which he definitely did read. This, I think, is the last slide that I can share with you. Here we go. Israel. This is a weekly magazine of the Jewish community of Italy. And this particular issue, which came out around the time of the premiere of the Sacred Service in Torino, consists, as the other issues did in this period, of 10 pages. And 4 of the 10 pages are devoted to Ernest Bloch and the premiere of the Sacred Service. Now, this is an episode in Bloch's Italian career, let's say, which has been touched upon rather lightly by Clara Moritz in her very fine book, Jewish Identities. And it's worth just sort of going over why this was such an upsetting experience for Bloch. So that issue of Israel includes an introductory article by Mary Tebaldi Chiesa, an interview with Bloch himself, an article on the music by another very young musicologist, Massimo Mila, much more tempered, and which actually responds to some of the objections raised by Fedele D'Amico a year before, and an article which, for its overt hostility to Bloch, probably comes in second place, right behind the one by Fedele D'Amico. This article was written by the Italian Jewish ethnomusicologist Leo Levi, who criticized the sacred service from a specifically Jewish point of view. So Levi, a traditionally observant Jew, like most affiliated members of the community in Italy, was angered by many aspects of the work and the performance. The fact that it was performed and broadcast on a Friday evening meant that Sabbath-observing Jews were effectively excluded from being able to tune in. and hear it over the radio. It bothered him that the baritone soloist was a Gentile who sang with his head uncovered. It bothered him that during the performance there was a Roman Catholic priest sitting close by to his own seat. It bothered him that the performance took place in a theater which had once been the property of the Savoia, the royal family, which was notoriously anti-Semitic. And as for the work itself, Levi was baffled by Bloch's decision to set the Saturday morning service to music when other parts of the liturgy would have more dramatic interest to offer. Clearly, he did not understand how the commission came about from Reuben Rinder in San Francisco and so on. Moreover, Levi felt that the liturgical text had been diluted and corrupted through the tampering of this wrong-headed, universalizing tendency of the movement of Reform Judaism, which removed every element of particularist urgency and rendered the text pointless. Above all, Levi found nothing Jewish in the music at all. We know that Bloch reacted very, very strongly to this article. It was extremely painful for him to be rejected by someone speaking from that point of view. And we can also see why Bloch would have taken such comfort in the aftermath of that negative review, when a very different view was expressed by another, much more authoritative voice of Jewish orthodoxy in Italy, Rabbi Alessandro Fano in Milan. This is the rabbi, by the way, who had assisted Mary Tibali Chiesa in preparing her a translation of the text of the sacred service. She herself did not know Hebrew. Rabbi Fano assured Bloch that his setting of the final hymn had perfectly captured the sense of the words. There is one final interesting chapter in the story of Bloch reception of Italy, in which again we find Mary Tibali Chiesa playing a pivotal role, and that is the performance of Macbeth in 1938. And this really is something which ought to take your breath away. 1938 was the self-same year of what I mentioned earlier, the Leggi Razziali, which basically banned Jews from every kind of presence in public life, including musical performance. Tibali Chiesa was the one who prepared the Italian singing translation used for that staging in Naples in 1938. And after those performances, Bloch basically is going to disappear, which is another good reason for restricting this kind of survey to the fascist period. There really is quite a hiatus in Bloch performance, insofar as his music could not be performed for a number of years. Only after World War II did it start being heard again, including with further performances of the opera Macbeth. But there is a very interesting incident which has been discussed from various points of view that actually is something which I guess makes it clear that though the work is performed in Naples, you can hear menacing rumbling going on in the background. And this is another very interesting and important Italian source of information, which I don't believe has been cited by anyone else, the memoirs of another Italian musician, Livio Lutzatto, who actually got to know Bloch through his own work as a stage manager, not really an artistic visionary of theater staging, but someone who was basically a traffic cop and made sure people rehearsed and knew when to enter and so on. He is an eyewitness to a very interesting episode. At the general rehearsal for Macbeth in Naples, the conductor, and I'm sorry I forget who the conductor is indisposed, and Ernest Bloch volunteers to lead the rehearsal instead, but he is prevented from doing so. And what Lutzatto has heard is that this is because Bloch is Jewish. It was seen as inappropriate for a Jewish person to come and lead the orchestra. Now, this is a good 6 months before anti-Semitism became official Italian government policy. Eventually, the rehearsal went through under someone else's direction. The performances were greeted very warmly. But even during that last phase of this generally positive period of Bloch reception in Italy, you can already see what's going to come next. Thank you so much. And the floor is open for any questions. By the way, I'm looking at Myron Silberstein. That Castelnuovo Tedesco piece, the variations on a children's theme, was played by a friend of mine. I was able to get someone to help me out in preparing this. And I did that because it has never been recorded by anyone.
Oh, how interesting.
So if, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like a really lovely piece. And,
Yeah.
you know, my entire MO as a pianist is to bring out things that have never been recorded by anyone.
Aha, okay. Well, we can talk about it.
Yeah, that would be great.
The floor is open for your comments or questions. You know, I always hesitate to say that I haven't seen anything cited elsewhere in the literature because the literature is so immense. And it's not as though I've combed through all of it by any means. And I've already mentioned there are a number of important sources that I've yet to get my hands on, including some of the original Bloch correspondence. The private papers of Mary Tebaldi Chiesa, I am sure, must have a gold mine's worth of documentary evidence about Bloch and their relationship, their friendship. And if I've said anything which is actually to be corrected on the basis of other things you know, please don't be shy about telling me.
I just wanted to mention that if you check the biographical tab on the Ernest Bloch website, where we quote from Lewinsky, there are quite a few references to what Jesse has been talking about.
Good. Thank you.
Can I ask how much longer he stayed in Italy? I mean, when did he arrive there, and how long did he stay, basically?
These were a series of individual trips that he made. He didn't actually settle down in Italy for a period of months. So during the 1930s, I guess from 1930 until 1933 or 4, his home base was the Italian canton of the Ticino. And then he settled somewhere else in Switzerland. And I believe that the 1938 production of Macbeth, that was another separate trip. So he never actually settled anywhere in Italy.
Thanks.
Just going back to Macbeth, I mean, his librettist was a really important French Jew as well.
Yes,
I wonder if that's something to do with categorizing it as a French work.
Yes, and I have a strong suspicion that Pizzetti, in writing about this and not mentioning anything at all about Jews or Judaism, simply did not know about Flag.
What I found particularly interesting as somebody who sort of specializes in the neo-romantic movement in American music during the 20th century, and I have always seen Bloch as in many ways the father of this movement, although that seems at first glance not to make very much sense. But you filled in some missing links for me, because Italian American composers were very crucial in the neo-romantic American composer movement. And I know that Nicholas Flagello studied with Pizzetti, and one of his favorite composers was Bloch, and he always told me that Bloch was very well loved in Italy. And so this sort of links together these disparate observations that I've had into something that creates a kind of coherence.
Good, thank you. Yep. You know, it's a very interesting feature of Italian history and Italian cultural life in general is that it's quite riven by polemics and enmities. I mean, it's a tradition, I suppose, that goes way back, and I don't want to generalize too broadly, but, you know, it's the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, even today, or going even further back, these wars between neighboring Italian communes. And I mention this because it's true that he was beloved in Italy by a certain party. This is actually one of the things that Fedele D'Amico indicates in that extremely negative review. Whereas there's also another party, which is on the side of modernism and experimentation and a renovation of the language of music. This is something which Carlo Picardi, I think, points out, namely that when Bloch's music is performed, when the sacred service is performed, he found himself inserted into a kind of ongoing battle that had been raging in Italy. There had been a manifesto of, I forget what it's called, I think a manifesto of romantic musicians. This is an age of manifestos where people with all kinds of different positions publish a sort of statement of faith, a kind of credo. They get long lists of signatures. And we have a fascist intellectual manifesto in 1925 signed by Pizzetti. We have an anti-fascist manifesto signed by Benedetto Croce, the great Italian philosopher. And we have these other sort of lesser manifestos, including this one by Italian, more or less conservatively oriented or romantically oriented composers who are completely out of sympathy with some of the more radical experiments, as they saw them, in the music of Alfredo Casella and Gianfrancesco Malipiero. Gianfrancesco Malipiero. So this is why it gets to be a kind of explosion of hostility. Bloch's music by 1933 is being championed by certain people who are very much the enemy of someone like Fedele D'Amico. So a word like beloved really needs to be unpacked and seen in the context of all of these divisions and hostilities in Italian musical life. Alex.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really fascinating. I was really intrigued by so many of the Italian commentators on Bloch, both pro and con. I have looked at some of those articles. I mean, my Italian is really very limited, but I could tell, even just from very limited understanding, that the hyperbole and you know the sort of extraordinary, how shall I say, vivid descriptions of what must have been going on in Bloch's mind when he composed this piece. I mean, complete fantasy worlds that these critics conjured up, very evocative, very powerful, actually. Whether actually that's what Bloch was thinking at the time when he was composing, it's sort of, shall we say, open to question, but they certainly evoked a huge sound world, which was totally fascinating. And I think that has an application also to the writings of Mary Tibel de Chiesa, because I remember Suzanne Bloch, daughter of Ernest Bloch, saying that one has to take with a pinch of salt, a very large pinch of salt, a lot of the things that she wrote about Bloch's early life, because apparently she made up some of those anecdotes. About him, about the anti-Semitism he experienced when he was a schoolboy, about the various incidents that happened in his early life. Now, I don't know whether that's the case or not, because I mean, Suzanne Bloch was also a little bit romantic about her father sometimes when describing, you know, not only his early life, but his later life as well. but I do think, you know, that this can be a bit of a problem when one's trying to get to the essence or to the truth of what actually happened factually to somebody in their early life, when there is no real documentation except a few letters which do appear in the Levinsky-Dijon volume 1 right at the beginning. But otherwise, there's really not a lot of documentation about, not so much about his compositional life, but also about, you know, what was happening to him, you know, in Geneva. I mean, his experiences, for example, in the Geneva synagogue, which was sometimes rather negative, and things of that kind. Well, a few letters, but not a huge corpus of material. And so then along comes Mary Tibel de Chiesa, and she builds up this whole edifice of, you know, of some kind of wild stories that apparently that were part of Bloch's early experience. So, but I do think that it's nevertheless, in amongst all of that, very valuable. There's a very valuable, because in amongst, you know, all the hyperbole, there are some nuggets of really, really interesting information.
Good, thank you. I mentioned several of the other musical biographies authored by Mary Tibel de Chiesa. I didn't mention that altogether she published from, let's say, the 1920s until the 1940s, about 80 books, 80. Novels, short stories, a large number of books for children. In a way, I suppose this is the risk you run. If you are a gifted writer of fiction and you're writing a biography of someone, it's kind of like Stendhal's biographies of Rossini and Haydn. You're never really sure when he's just inventing stuff out of thin air. I didn't know that story about the boyhood, where these bullies, these schoolmates, sort of torment him, and I forget exactly what, they shove him down and they force him to say how much he enjoys being shoved or something like that. I had no idea that never happened. You mentioned that this had been mentioned to you by, was it Suzanne Bloch? How does she know that it didn't happen? I'm just curious.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah. It's just, you know, like an open question in a way. It may well have been, or it may have been exaggerated for effect, but there may have been some elements of that in his early experience.
Tibel de Chiesa meets him for the first time in October of 1931. And Matt hops on the train, not a long ride from Milan to Lugano. And if she heard it anywhere, it must have been directly from him. Again, not proof positive that these anecdotes are authentic, but maybe we shouldn't be quite so quick to point an accusatory finger at Mary Tibel de Chiesa for inventing it.
And I think also, I mean, there was some talk about whether he and Mary Tibel de Chiesa had an affair. Apparently not. Apparently this was a platonic friendship.
Right.
Jesse,
He did have an affair with another Italian woman during the same years.
Indeed.
Ada Iesi.
when did you say she first met him?
1931.
And where was that?
In Roveredo. She went up to visit him where he was living in the Ticino. She talks about this first meeting in the book on Bloch.
I think she wrote also a very important article for that one edition of a journal called Musica Hebraica, which was published in Jerusalem, 1938.
Yes.
And there's a very, very, interesting corpus of material in that one. It got discontinued because of the war, so they were going to continue it, but in fact there was only one edition. And there were a number of articles about, I think 2 or 3 articles about Bloch, one of which was hers, and it was a significant one indeed. And it's where that famous quote comes, where Bloch writes, you know, to what extent this is Jewish, to what extent this is just Ernest Bloch, the future will tell. That's the end of the quote. And that appears there for the first time, apparently.
I see.
Can I just mention one other thing? You mentioned quite importantly about Macbeth. I remember Macbeth was performed in a concert version in London in 1975. and this was over the radio. It was a concert, well, a sort of semi-staged performance. And what's interesting about it was, apart from the performance, which was tremendously curtailed, they cut massively, but were the comments of the critics. Comments of the critics, many of them actually compared Bloch with Verdi. This was this kind of game that they liked to play, and some of them preferred one and some of them preferred the other. Some of them were not very kind to Bloch by saying, well, of course, it would have been beneath Bloch's dignity to consult with the Verdi opera before composing his own in order to learn something about how to write this opera, when in fact the Verdi opera at the time that Bloch composed Macbeth was not known. It had gone into disuse. It was on the shelf somewhere, and it was only kind of rediscovered at a later stage, long after Bloch had composed his own. So the critics were very mixed in their feelings about it, especially from the point of view of comparison.
Yes. It's true. Virtually no one was performing any of Verdi's earlier operas, or the operas he wrote before Rigoletto. And to the extent that people paid any attention at all to that early repertoire, it was with an attitude of real disdain and condescension.
I'm interested in this Leo Levy's criticism. Was that much more really about Italian Judaism and Californian Judaism at the time, rather than about the music?
I would say a substantial part of that article really has nothing to do with music, and is really more the reaction of an observant Orthodox Jew to an expression of Reform Judaism, or at least a more universalizing, reaching out to the larger community beyond the Jewish community. My own feeling is that he probably should have said, "Thank you for asking me, but I really don't think I should contribute an article about this. I can't really evaluate this fairly." That is to say, his rejection was not so much of the way that Bloch carried this task out, but the task itself. He objected to the whole idea in principle. A setting of this Hebrew text in an Italian translation for voices and instruments on a Friday night, even though it was a Saturday morning liturgy. And all of these Gentiles getting into the performance and so on. He was just so alienated by the entire setup of this performance that he could barely even evaluate the work fairly.
But the question does arise, doesn't it? Why on earth did they put it on a Friday night?
I agree.
I mean, what was going on? I mean, I know that in this country as well, the BBC sometimes put on programs of Jewish interest on Yom Kippur, because they think Jewish people, well, Yom Kippur is a festival, it's a holiday, and therefore Jews will not be doing anything else. They will be listening to the radio, but not understanding that it's not the same. You can't actually put on things on the radio on Shabbat or on festivals, because Jewish people won't be able to. And it's, generally speaking, this has not always been understood, even in this country. But to put a sacred service on the radio on Friday night, it seems to me at least, a little bit thoughtless, a little bit insensitive. And I can understand that there would be people who would object to that. But at the same time, Ernest Bloch was sometimes very upset at the way Jews received his music, and so that therefore often thought of as being, in quotation marks, anti-Semitic, although he wasn't anti-Semitic, but he was against those Jews who didn't understand what he was doing.
Right. Well, just to clarify one thing, even though the performance takes place on a Friday evening, that itself is not a reason that Jews cannot attend. They can certainly go out to a concert. It may not be considered the ideal way for an observant Jew to spend a Friday evening. But it's possible, and in fact, Leo Levi himself does that. He goes out on a Friday evening, there is no prohibition. It's the broadcast, it's the transmission, and the fact that Jews are not able to turn on anything requiring electricity that effectively excludes them from the experience of being able to hear the broadcast. And I agree with you, that is a legitimate observation, and it does betray a certain kind of cluelessness about what you're doing. At the same time, the people who know about this prohibition are, number one, observant Jews, and number two, people who know about observant Jews. And that's a minority. And most people, including most assimilated Jews, have a very different outlook on life, according to which Friday evening is just another evening. And there's no particular reason why you can't do something on a Friday evening that you could also do on a Tuesday evening. So I think that ignorance rather than bad faith is maybe a little bit closer to the heart of this issue.
Okay.
Well, if there are no further comments or questions, I wonder if it might be time to wrap this up.
I'll be saying a bit more about the Sacred Service in the next session. So
Excellent, excellent.
continued.
Okay, great.